while they work on that, good morning everyone, salam, thank you all for coming out early on a Saturday morning. Some of you flew in from the West Coast, some of you flew in from Chicago. Thank you all for being here. I usually tell students to come to class prepared, having read, prepared questions for discussion and so on. Today we did the opposite. None of us are prepared. We just met, in this case of Lena, we just met Lena, but the speakers have already been introduced. I've known Mark, one of our most creative poetic voices. I've known Mark for several years. Latif, Harlem-based, known him for many years, completing a PhD here at Columbia, novelist, jazz musician, and a journalist, and a very astute observer of Harlem politics and culture. And Lena Khan, filmmaker. Should I mention that you were born in Canada? Is that okay? She was born in Canada but lives in Los Angeles today. So she'll bring a different perspective. Let me just set up some questions and then I'll pass the mic over to our speakers so they can speak for 5-7 minutes about their work. The topic today is history, nostalgia, and memory. Let me come at the question this way. A few years ago, I was a fellow at the Open Society Institute, the Soros Foundation downtown. They have an office here in New York and they have an office in Brussels. And they have a project called At Home in Europe on Muslims in Europe. Right? So they produce studies trying to gauge the status, conditions of Muslims in Europe. And according to the studies that they produced, they looked at 14 cities. And in most of those cities, if not all 14 European cities from Rotterdam to Birmingham to Paris, Marseille, and so on, where you have Muslim communities, you tend to have three phenomena. You tend to have a far-right movement, right? A xenophobic far-right movement targeting those Muslim communities. You tend to have hostile media coverage, Fox News-style right-wing media that's stirring up discourse against Muslim communities. And you tend to have the state targeting Muslim communities with all kinds of policies, whether it's surveillance, or the headscarf or banning of the building of minarets, and so on. Right? So these three trends also exist in the United States. Right? You also have state policies hostile to Muslims. You also have right-wing movements, such as the Tea Party movement. And you tend to have, of course, negative, unflattering media depictions. My interest in my work is trying to understand how young Muslims respond to surveillance, how they respond to the climate and the politics of the last 15 years. How do young Muslims respond? Right? I mean, there's been a mobilization. A number of people have written about this, from Murtaza, Civil Rights for the Intercept, to Foreign Policy, have spoken about how the Muslim American community has moved left in the last 10-15 years. There's been a shift from voting for the Republican Party to voting for the Democratic Party. Right? So there's been a shift to the left. More interesting to me is the shift towards race activism. Right? There's a shift towards race activism that you're seeing among young Muslims in Europe. Right? You're seeing the rise of movements such as the Black Panther Party of Greece, the Black Panther Party of France, the Black Panther Party of Sweden, the Natives of the Republic, which is a Black Power-style party in England. In the United States, Muslims here, Muslims of immigrant descent tend to be more affluent, more comfortable, tend to be middle class. There isn't an immigrant Muslim underclass community just yet in the US, but even in the United States, you're seeing increased race activism, right? Pushing the Census Bureau, for example, to start categorizing North African and Middle Eastern communities as a minority, right? You're seeing the rise of groups and movements that are engaged in racial justice, social justice. You're seeing a greater Muslim presence in Black Lives Matter. And what's interesting to me in the rise of these movements is how they tend to revive, use, deploy Black history, right? African American history. So that's the first point. The second point, I was just looking at a piece in The Guardian on neoliberalism. One of the most circulated pieces is about neoliberalism as an ideology, right? And the crisis of the global left, right? Where is the left today? Given the mass inequality, given the rise of the transnational right. The right is resurgent across, right? If you look at from the Middle East all the way to the United States, via Europe, Eastern Europe, and so on, you see the right is resurgent. Given the crisis of the left, if you're a young person who's interested in social justice, in racial justice, in gender equality, where do you go? Right? This applies to youth everywhere, but especially for young Muslims, where do you go? Right? So there's a crisis of identity, there's a lack of a narrative of social justice. Where do you go if you're a young 20-year-old growing up in Dearborn or Patterson or who's interested in a liberation theology. Is there such a thing in the Muslim community as a left movement? Yes, there are scholars that we can talk to, right? There's Farid Isaac, there's Hassan Hanafi, there's Tariq Ramadan. But in terms of a left, of a progressive movement, is there such a movement, or is there not? Where do you go? In my work, again, you find people gravitating towards the Black freedom movement. You have young Muslims gravitating towards African American Islam, gravitating towards some strand of African American history or the Black freedom movement more broadly. And this is where the role of artists come in, artists and history. Right? It is very often artists, poets, musicians, filmmakers who are disseminating, reviving, resuscitating Black history and other histories for the consumption or to educate young Muslims today in the hopes of creating some sort of movement. Right? So we are seeing movements developing, and I would say artists are at the heart of these movements. We are seeing progressive Muslims forming, progressive Muslim movements forming, and artists are at the heart of this process of movement formation. That's my way of framing the conversation. Let me hand things over. Lena, should we start with you?
Like you said, a lot of us didn't prepare things, but we have the questions. My work focuses more on, I have my first feature film. It's a feature comedy called The Tiger Hunter, world premiering next week in Los Angeles and around the country. And so that, while it's a comedy, it's built on the story of a young man, that's Danny Pudi from Community, who plays a young man named Sony Malik, who comes from India in the 1970s on this like grand quest for glory to try to live up to the memory and grandeur of his late father back home, who was like this larger-than-life tiger hunter. And to build this movie, we went around and we were interviewing dozens and dozens of immigrants from different countries, a lot of them Muslim, who came in the 1970s. And a lot of their stories are what informed their narrative. And a lot of what I've been operating on doing in my work, and I remember when I guess I became more known in the Muslim community, is that there was this little video I had done that had a whole bunch of Muslims kind of answering the question, what would you tell everybody if you had a chance? This little video called A Land Called Paradise that went around. And after that, people were always looking to me almost as if like, you know, when are you going to write the big Muslim movie or the movie that's all about all the stuff that we want to tell? And it's very loaded to be a Muslim in Hollywood. You're like the only one, or there's maybe a few others, and everybody wants you to be the one person who will tell everything that's missing from the collective memory of the United States. So it's a problem. And what I found is, whereas my lead actor will talk about his roots, and I found out that his father is Indian, he'll talk about that very nonchalantly, no problem. Muslims have this little bit of a hesitance, as if the way we define ourselves has always been in response to how people perceive us. So you find movies, I won't mention them, but certain movies are very reactionary in what they're doing, and you have a problem in how people perceive us then, that we don't stand with the same sort of integrity and posturing as everybody else. So I think I'll wait till the questions in case any of that comes up, but just to give you an idea of my work in case I reference my movie and you're like, what the heck is she talking about?
Assalamu alaikum, all of you. I think I'd also go through my, I have a previous work which was related to how I was writing about a response to the usual depiction of Somalis in the mainstream media, which is, you know, either pirate or warlord, terrorist. So it was this terra incognita where there were no human beings that lived there, and that moved me in 2008, I believe, something like that, to respond to the state's violence, militarism, and the precursor to that is, of course, you know, corporate media. You can say Christiana Amanpour somewhat, you know, inspired me to react to her in that sense of how rapidly she's always seeking to annihilate terrorists wherever they may be in this world. So the interesting part about that is that if you look at it, I'm here in Harlem, but that that sense of identity, race, caricature of Hollywood, and all those things, created that novel in the sense of it being intertwined with nostalgia. So I decided I was going to create a work that, if you will, bridge the gap and influence conceptually someone in, I always use the Midwest for some reason, to perhaps get a real version of what's going on and contextualize it that way. But in essence, it's in the sense of nostalgia, history, and space. Here I am, all the way across the Atlantic, writing about this place in the Horn of Africa, which I had left years ago. Of course, there's a back and forth. But later on, after that work, and most of all, what I wanted to do was get away from those child soldier stories, pornographic famine, and violence, and create the realities that are there, not to present a feel-good narrative or anything like that, but to get away from these blockbuster bloody pages and the ongoing racism that continues to show this sort of monster in imagery. So that was that, and the following novel, which I'm working on now, started in 2011. Every writer thinks that they must have a second novel, whether you actually have the right one or not, you have no idea. But you think it's sexy in the beginning. And in 2011, I started a novel called Doorman. And Doorman was about a Somali artist who was a genius painter, but couldn't, society had relegated him, the mainstream society, him being black, Muslim, and all of those things. And, we were talking about Fab a few seconds ago, and he had this incredible accent that, made sure that mainstream doors were shut against him anywhere he went. So he wasn't able to really, although he was not able to function on a regular basis as what he was, which was a painter, an artist, And so he was standing at this in-between space where he's a visible deterrent to the public at large, those guys who can't come in, and really some sort of thing that was in between that lobby and the outside for the residents who were in that Upper West Side, the Socialist Republic of the Upper West Side, and so what inspired that was I have lived in Harlem for something, I don't want to say how long because it'll age me, but it's 2 decades plus. And in the 90s there was a huge, when I first came here, first of all, there was a lot of immigrants who were Somali and who had been here and had come in as merchant seamen from the Red Sea. And some of them settled in the late 19th century in Wales, Cardiff. And a group of them were here, at least known in the 1920s onwards. I'm sure it was earlier. But when I came in 87, it was a rough spot. Harlem was, not easy. So they were here, and part of the inspiration of that is from 87 to about the early 90s. A lot of them were old, having been here for a very long time. And then they were replaced by West African. We're from East Africa, but they were replaced by a huge influx of West Africans from Ivory Coast, Senegal, you name it, in the 90s. And so I've been living with, not only being an immigrant, but I've been living with other immigrants and seeing through the everyday what's going on. A lot of them are French speaking. Some of them had, a good portion had no education in the sense of accessing anything. And even if they did, they were speaking it, were speaking in a different language, or had learned in a different language. So again, entry to the mainstream was very difficult. This, on top of the racism. So the doorman was an attempt by me to kind of sort of convey the colorful, beautiful, and difficult, as Malcolm would say, the other part, American nightmare, and the search for glory, like she's doing. And then I found myself questioning how I would do that through the doorman. But to come back to the heart of the matter was the idea of nostalgia and how, while I was writing the doorman, the protagonist was someone who came here as older and was already formed. But the thing was that I was always reaching back to a discrete moment where Africa or East Africa was somewhere very far, and it was always in a backward movement, and meaning that it had to be located in a history that is over there. And the reality of it, later on, fast forward a few years after struggling with the work, and continuing to struggle, I found out that one of the reasons why there was a huge struggle between me and the work was that the lives of the immigrant, and the sense of nostalgia, is concurrent. It's fluid. There's a relationship between the continent and here, including myself, whether it is a back and forth, or travel, or despite the travel restrictions in the beginning for people who didn't come in here with papers and stuff like that, there's usually a 6 or 7 year sort of, geographical incarceration, by not having that nation-state paperwork. So the whole epiphany came when I realized that it was a concurrent history. It was a history that not only is one that is the past, but it's one that you bring with it, and it's one that is moving forward, and history itself keeps going with momentum to the future. And it's not a location that can be isolated in the sense of saying, okay, whenever I want to write about, Joe Johnson, incidentally, the main character had a Christian name, although he was Somali, majority of them are Muslims. And that came about because he was using someone else's paperwork to work. So Joe Johnson was his name, and by the time he passed on, nobody knew anything about him because, again, an erasure arises from even in death, where the people in the apartment don't know where he's from because, somewhere the woman was asked who'd been in the building for 20 years and he has been serving her, who's Joe Johnson? And she says, well, I know he's from somewhere in Africa. And the point of the matter is that book didn't work. It morphed into a book called Musa. When I got the understanding that for this to work, for me to actually write about myself and that group, particularly post 9/11, and to understand the existential of the immigrant, of various things, particularly the ones in Harlem, mainly West African, East African, but I know many other people. But the point of the matter is I had to include a relationship with Africa, with West Africa, so I came up with a fictitious country in the post-colony, and in there I have the immigrant who is here, strived and done a lot of work, returning after, what has come to be known now as a Trumpism, who's going to ship like 12 million people, something like that. That exasperation and with the racism and decides to go back. So that opened up the work to now have a continuous, just like the immigrant who is here, whether it's on phone call or whether it's going back or sending money, remittances or things like that. The mind has that duality. The relationship is physical in the sense of the communication and the speaking of a language and things like that. And so Musa returns to the post-colonial country and decides that he's going to make a go at it in that country, and which the country of his birth, but he's been away and he's coming back with an American passport. And I'm not going to belabor this, but the thing is, he goes back and he finds out that white supremacy is everywhere. The privileged expat is first to be served, he's last to be heard. It continues in that sense. So again, as the young lady was talking about, where is particularly home, and the work generally is trying to unravel the realities of how white supremacy is everywhere, meaning hegemonic, it's part of the power and all that. And this can be understood easily in the sense of how many people use import skin lightening colors throughout the subaltern. There is that. So the question of nostalgia, identity, history, has a huge relationship to this understanding that it's quite concurrent, forward-looking, not necessarily a pristine place that one has left. I'll leave it at that.
Saludos, salams, ¿qué onda? Everyone's just quiet. I want to start with just two ideas and then just a quick story. One, this entire gathering is around story, and story and creativity are intimate partners in a way. And then there's a creative process and there's a creative product, and we often get focused on the product that we forget about the process. For me, the product itself is just an outward expression of an inner dialogue a person or a people are having. And that dialogue could be of pain, it could be of love, it could be of fear, it could be of tragedy, it could be of loss, it could be of dreams, it could be desire. But there's something inside that needs to be shared out. And maybe it needs to just be shared out with you, maybe it needs to be shared out with as many as many people as possible. But there's an inward dialogue that then has an outward expression. And the second concept is that creativity is the engine of all innovation. That without the creative element, new ideas and introduction and inventions do not exist on this earth. And I share those two ideas because for me, it's interesting coming up to places and people are like, okay, so you're going to speak on story, or you're going to, but then if I'm in an education or an academic circle, it's like, okay, you're going to speak on knowledge production. Or if you're in a different country, it's like, okay, you're going to talk about theories of change and social impact. And then when you meet someone for the first time, then they're like, so what do you do? Like, what's the box? Similarly, you're like, where are you from? What do you do is the new where are you from? Like what is the little box you can put in? And for me, this is where it gets back to the creative process. I was born in Alaska, 1975, to a father who was born in Wyoming in 1936, who turns 80 this Tuesday, and his parents left Mexico in the late 1919. On my mother's side being French-Canadian, and her ending up also in Washington and then meeting and then getting married and then somehow getting this great idea that Alaska is a great place to raise a child. Let's do that. Being born there, and being born to parents, and being born to trees and bears, that's your normal. Even though you're like, this isn't normal, it's your normal, and everyone has a normal in the world. The normal is the entry point in which you start your relationship with this planet. My normal changed when I was 14, when my mother committed suicide. And a large part of that was from her lifelong battle with clinical depression that she lost. My response to that, as any human being, as like a 14-year-old, is I'm gonna just go inside. I really don't want to talk to people. I don't want to deal with this world. Why are we here? Why am I on this planet? I'm the only brown kid in this village. I get told all these ugly things, and it's like my mom just passed. My dad's trying to deal with it. Why am I alive? And my way of trying to answer that question was just to stay quiet. And after about 5 years, I realized that wasn't working. I was like, okay, this isn't a good strategy. Because I turned 19, then I turned 20, and I turned 21, and I was still hurting inside. And so I then started saying, okay, if I have this pain and I can't heal it myself, maybe someone else knows how to heal it. And so I began asking other people, tell me about your story, your journey, and your pain. And they started sharing. And I was like, okay, and how are you healing from that? And some had answers, and some were just like me. I have no clue, son. Like, we're all lost out here. Especially it's mid-90s, post-Reagan era, and then, of course, you have hip-hop reality completely being different, like the Biggie, Tupac wars going on, and I'm like in Colorado at the time. All this is going on, and so in these conversations, I was like, I just need to listen to folks. And the more I listened to folks, the more I understood that my pain was not the only pain. And that began taking me to other countries. The first country outside of the US, in Canada, for me going was Palestine in 2003 for a media journalism initiative around how do we introduce stories to younger generations. And in each time I heard a story, not just in Palestine, but in my entire journey, it was like, okay, wow, we're all going through it. We have different points of entry and we have different styles of wounds, but we're all going through it. And then that took me to Cuba, and then that took me to Lebanon, and then that took me to foster homes in Portugal, and then it took me to recently indigenous islands in the South Pacific, then it took me to North Africa, then it took me to South Asia, and it took me to over 20 different countries of just trying to understand how do human beings feel about being alive in this specific moment in human history. And the more I traveled, two things just kept on coming up. One, we're all going through it. And second, we're all expressing that frustration and pain of going through it in very different ways. And so for me, my work deals with that. How do I create spaces of connection for people to identify the echoes that exist across this planet of being alive at this specific moment in human history? How does that space of connection create a space for us both to understand, explore, and even create new identity frameworks? Because often, like even when we're talking about this idea of race, it's like, do we really heal the violence of race by essentializing it? Or are we really saying, what does it mean to be human, and what are the different subcategories of human, and what are the ways that these then get articulated, expressed? And then part of this in this journey for me was like, I'm really tired of talking about pain. I'm 40. It was in my early 30s that I was like, is my entire life going to be defined by loss? Or is there love in the world? And is there growing in the world? And is this a world of binaries where you can only have either or, you can have both simultaneously? I enjoy sharing that with audiences through storytelling. I enjoy more and more across this world doing that through what we call deep story listening, which I think most of us don't take the time to do, which is just shut up and create spaces for other people to express. and then encourage and invite dialogue from that, and then help people kind of take bird's eye view of like, oh, did you notice here are the echoes of one another? And then that's where we say the magic happens. You know, what happens after that, I don't know. You know, but I do know we need new starting points.
Thank you all for those terrific introductions. Let me begin by asking a question about what you alluded to, being a Muslim in Hollywood, and what sort of called the burden of representation, how everybody expects you to fill in the vacuum. Everything that we don't know about Muslims, Lena's going to fill it in her film or in her speech. What burden is, can you talk a little bit to the entire panel? What pressure is there to represent as Muslims in the art? What does it mean to be a Muslim artist these days in the for the last 15 years? Must our art be necessarily political? Must it necessarily address questions of the hate and pressure and policies that we face? Or can we come at the Muslim predicament in a more oblique, indirect way? But simply, if you want to say a word on the pressures and the responsibilities of Muslim artists.
Yeah, it's funny because while the main character of the movie I have right now does incidentally happen to be Muslim, that's not really the driving force behind the movie. The next movie I'm working on is a comedy about about magicians, and one of them deals with chronic depression, and there's a competition between him and a mentalist. And I realized I was getting so much flack from the Muslim community. They're like, here you are, you're really doing something for yourself, you got a Muslim in your movie, you got a Pakistani in your movie, now you're making a movie about magicians. And I didn't understand, like, what was the problem there? And really what people have is, we have this collective insecurity as Muslims, that what I spoke to a little bit before about kind of this idea of collective memory, that at least in terms of American, I was born in Canada, I grew up here, I don't really know much else about other places, is that in the stories that are woven and told right now about all the different groups that came to America, it's sort of like when you have a family album, right? Everybody's looking through the family album, like, oh, you remember Jed, you remember Amy, oh man, Amy was great, you remember that one time we did this and somebody else chips in, and somebody else chips in, and somebody else chips in. And so you have that going on for so many different groups in this country, and the Muslims are like cousin Jeb, who had never made it into the photo album, and now all the Muslims are really angry because they wanted to be included, and if you come over, they're like, please correct all the wrongs because nobody remembers us, and they don't remember us the way we want, because film and art and writing are a way that when things have gone, that's kind of how we're remembered and how we're colored. And so what I have is so many people coming, I get emails, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 emails a week from people pitching a movie, be like, you need to make a movie about this, you need to make a movie about that, all very, very strong Muslim issues that I worked in development for a number of years, honestly will never see the light of day, because what they're missing is that ingredient that why do other people want to hear that story when you have this reactionary story that isn't relating to other people on the level of things that people find valuable, whether it's love or pain or things like that. So it's funny because after all that, and I wasn't really making work for Muslims so much, and this movie just happened to be the case. And really, I think personal experience might speak to it a little bit more, is that I was working in development when I was, in my early 20s, and I was like, I want to make a movie, right? And I didn't know what it was going to be yet, and I'd been pitching all these different movies. And I never thought that the movie that would actually become popular, that would get kind of celebrities and this and that would get traction, would be the movie that happens to be about, have some immigrants coming into the country and building a microwave and going on a crazy road trip and things like that. I thought it was going to be, I had a movie set in a prison with people that had nothing to do with me and things like that. But people, I stopped thinking so much about what I wanted to represent and started thinking more about just writing what I knew. And I drew on the stories of my father, I drew on the stories of other people that, the central themes of the movie are things that I grew up relating to, and that's sort of the idea of the choices you have to make with ambition in the society and the things you have to let go of. But anyways, to speak to what you're saying, I think we will get farther when we're not pushing so hard a certain narrative, and we're exploring more what it is about who we are and what drives us. So to give you an idea, I remember, and all these, I just had a son a little while ago, and so now apparently a a lot of people who have children, all they do is pass around parenting articles. It's like the thing to do. I don't know how anybody has time to read all those. But anyways, there was some New York Times article that the greatest indicator, apparently, according to them, of stability in a family. A lot of people say, what is it? Is it having dinner together every night? Is it having a talk to your kids whenever a problem happens? According to them, and I thought it made sense in the context of my family even, is that the greatest indicator of a strong family is a sense of family identity. That when you tell your kids about our family, your grandfather used to do this, or my family, they're Khans, and a lot of the time we say oh, that's such a Khan thing to do. We argue a lot. Oh man, the Khan side of the family is totally overpowering the Francisco side right now, right? And so it's the same sort of thing with us as Muslims, that when we can finally have some sort of sense of if not pride, then integrity and comfort with who we are, and not so much defining ourselves in terms of what we think we're supposed to be. All of our attempts to relate to each other, which is, again, through movies, art, writing, whatever it is, go that much farther. And so it was finally when I became comfortable being, with embracing a lot of my identities. My parents are Indian. I'm Muslim. I grew up here, and a lot of my struggles have to do as American. Those all ended up in my movie. And those related, and then I only have 3 Muslims working on my production of over 300 people. Those ended up relating to people way more than any other type of story that I was trying to tell. And I think we really have to figure out really what it is that defines us and go with that instead of trying so hard to be we need to have a Muslim narrative. People ask what is a Muslim artist? Who cares what a Muslim artist? Be an artist and try to help your Muslimness build your character. And that will speak to people a lot stronger than anything else. At least that's what's happened in my experience.
Do you want to say a word on it? Okay. Yeah, excellent response. Thank you. One of the things I notice, I'm on the faculty here, and this pressure to be a Muslim artist. Given the pressures that the Muslim community faces, very often we tend to get cornered intellectually and culturally. And one of the more depressing trends that you notice in higher education, right, not simply for Muslim students but minority students in general, is that they tend to study exactly where they come from. Right? Is that you rarely see Muslim students branching out, or minority students in general, because of the pressure, because of the misinformation and the political and intellectual harassment they feel. They very often stick to their particular area, right? So it's so we try to encourage students. Okay, you're Pakistani American, work on the Caribbean. You're a Caribbean Muslim, work on China, and so on. You can have a very powerful impact just in terms of how Muslims are represented, countering how Muslims are represented by branching out. Mark, you want to respond to the question of burdens of being a Muslim artist? Any thoughts on that? Must it be political? Must it be humanist?
I think the core question at the end of the day is it's an actual core philosophical question, which is when you go to sleep at night, what allows you to sleep well? I mean, at the end of this life, that's the same question that drives us spiritually, is what makes us feel that when our life ends, we're okay. I think every question around Muslim artists, there will always be people from echo chambers saying yes, 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 to antagonism, no, no, no. And the question is, what do you want to share with the world that when you go to bed that night, you feel, I did a good day. As long as you center that, everything else falls into place. All these other questions we can get into, which is sector, career, economy, how do you make livelihood, what are the roles and responsibilities of a person to their community and the people who raise them. But at the end of the day, it's you close your eyes, do you sleep well, or does something keep you up at night?
I don't consider it a burden anyway. That's one thing. I think it's just something that comes with a relationship to who you are in terms of addressing. I will put it out there that most of my work is political. It's driven by that. We live in an age of war and terror, where the United States is the premier purveyor of how could I put it, policing Muslims throughout the world. I mean, we could go and ask, look at how many countries have collapsed in that part. Somalia, Iraq, you name it. So the idea that that the systemic issues of race included institutional racism and the surveillance on the Muslim side, including here at the MSA, this particular organization back in, I don't know if it's still going on, does anybody know? So the thing is, how does one detach themselves from the one narrative of the mainstream and what that is? So most of my work and all of it, I think writing for me is fighting, and so yes, in a world where there are no categories, there are no oppression based on your faith or your skin color, I think yes, we would all love to be universal, like the guy in Chicago who's white writing a novel about Chicago, and it's considered to be a universal story. Whereas in my case, I might write a human story, or meaning that it seems that the human condition is located in the West, and it doesn't apply to Somalia or other places where other Muslims dwell, or within the United States. So I think not everyone has to do it, but I think that I don't know if it's really an option for a Muslim or black or whatever to have enough individual agency to circumvent the institutional and systemic power of oppression in every way that is there. So yeah, I think all of my work is political, and I don't consider it a burden. I think it is something that I feel is necessary. It's like a calling to some extent.
Thank you. Let's talk about the key issue, that is memory. What role does memory play in our work? Whoever wants to start. You want to go first?
How many people here have a memory of around the age 5 or 6? Like if you think back, you're like, oh, I can remember maybe my 5th birthday or 6th. Okay. How many of people in the audience have a memory of when they were 3? Okay, what about 2 or 1? Okay, a couple of hands go up. I like doing this, and we actually do this in different settings with different people, trying to understand when does memory start forming in the human brain. Because often when we talk about memory, there's personal memory, there's collective memory, but we forget about the mechanics of memory. Like how does the mind process time and store it, and then how do we access it? And then every time you access it, it changes it. And that's a really interesting thing, the reality that no memory is fixed. That even as you're remembering it, there's some subtle variation going on. And then the interesting thing for me, like having a 20-month-old daughter, who's running around and laughing and learning language, and it's like, and then touches something falls, and I'm like, I'm a horrible father. I'm like, okay, what's her first memory gonna be? And right now and the ironic thing is she already has memories. She remembers 2 months ago when a monkey in Morocco ran up and grabbed her yogurt and ran away. And she's like, Mommy, yogurt. Like, the monkey took my yogurt. She keeps on talking about it. And it's 2 months later, and I'm like, okay, so she has memory. But how long does that stay? And how is that also changing? Because for a lot of us, it's like you reinforce memory through stories. Or in the last 100 years through photographs, and now the last 50 years through videos. We see things and we're like, oh yeah, that happened. And we have a generation that's growing up that actually, from the age of infancy until grave, will have constant reinforcements of almost every moment. So when will memory start forming? And I say that to open up a conversation of like, what do we know about what really happened in life? And how do we know? Because for me, when I think about memory, I think about two things. Again, my daughter, and then I think about my dad who's turning 80. And I think about how each of them, their memories are going to do shape and are continually shaping how they see the world. One at the end of his life, where the memories are the places he goes where everyone's buried. That he has a chance to live and to laugh with them again. And for another, who the memory, like of what's forming now, hopefully will be things of like everything is possible for you. Whatever you want to do, we will nurture you in it. And if there's any structures, whether personal or systemic, that will try to prevent you from being a fuller human being, then we need to get rid of them. You know, and we want that to be the formation of your memory. Yeah, I just want to offer that actually. I want to hear what the others say before I get into anything else.
Just we'll come back to you. The role of memory in your work.
Part of the story I'm doing right now deals entirely on memory, but something that is important for us both as creators and consumers of different narratives and art forms is this idea that there's no such thing as an authentic memory. Anything that you remember, if nothing else, just came from your two eyes. And on the peripherals of your two eyes, there's something else that happened. And it's the same thing when you have photographs that seem like some of the most authentic things. Documentaries. You have what the camera saw and what happened on the right side of the frame that wasn't captured. And when we have the memories that we have preserved right now, even of history, you take the Vietnam War that's been presented in a certain way from everything from Rambo to Glory to Forrest Gump, that has this certain memory of how the nation remembers that war, and it even gets wrong what were the actual faults of that war and what caused it. A lot of us are like, if we had just gone forward all the way, etc., etc. There's different ways, and a lot of these art forms just double down on the memory that somebody else remembered. So one thing that I found this very important as creators of narratives as well as the consumers is that one of your functions really is, if you remember something, is jogging other people's memory. Because that's the only way it's going to get put forward into that other person's art form or storytelling or whatever it is. And I found it funny because even in the story that inspired the movie that I made, it was kind of started out with the story of my grandfather, who was a tiger hunter back in India, back when like tigers would literally ravage villages and stuff like that. And people would talk about him in such glowing terms. I literally found stories about him online. This very like legendary man in Lucknow, India, and he used to dance with roller skates on top of tabletops, and he would come and he would bring things from Europe. He's the only guy in the area. Yeah, it's a really weird memory to have, but that's what they remember of him. He danced on top of tables with roller skates. And he had this like swirly cool mustache, and everybody just thought he was amazing. And he had this charismatic presence, and everybody looks at him the way you would about some really old school, larger than life figure. And that's what everybody remembers, and that's what people told me. And then when I was learning more about him, I mean, he had 4 wives, which that's a different story, but it didn't go well with a lot of them. There was and probably a lot of it was his fault. And so there was a lot more to this man than what was laid down through the memories. And it's the same thing in terms of this immigrant story. Everybody remembers a certain narrative that everybody tells. A guy comes from, especially when it comes to like Indian immigrants, or you have movies like Eureka and things like that. Somebody comes from far away and they like find opportunity in America and they really need America. But it's interesting to learn that in the 60s, it wasn't just immigrants who needed America. You could say that more than that, America needed the immigrants, because they're the ones who in the 60s literally said on the higher levels, we don't have enough doctors and engineers to make this country stable. Let's ease the restrictions that we put on our visa requirements to countries, and they named countries literally like India, so that they could have more doctors and engineers come in. So a lot of this flood of engineers and doctors that we always laugh about why are there so many Desi ones, is because America needed them. But that's missing from that little narrative and memory, because nobody jogged somebody else's memory. People did remember that. My dad was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. We hadn't heard about it. Right? And then until it's inserted somehow into somebody's story or somebody's storytelling, you jog somebody else's memory. then it's gone. But if you let your memory be built on everybody else's memory and you forget about it, then that's what's going to happen. The other people are kind of shaping that story. I think I'll start with that and see where the market.
Okay. How many? I'm just curious. This is a literary event. I saw with the name protagonist. And how many people in here are undercover writers, or or closeted, or have come out?
Well, they're not going to closet it anymore.
Well, I'm asking them to come out because I think I'm going to talk about memory, talk shop about it. I mean, I think film is a little different. I mean, there's writing and all that, but there seems to be a much more of a collaborative sport, meaning that there's so many people involved when you're done, whatever. And writing a novel is something that is a lot more of a solo thing. And I guess we can become belligerent and stubborn, not being able to work with anyone else, having the wherewithal to act like God, but for that moment you have. So I'm going to enter the question of memory through how it applies to my craft and writing. And for example, I told a story before about how I was trying to capture the lives of where I live, all the immigrants who have come. So this is a collective memory that is stored by me through the living, the daily living of seeing kids running around and the moms running after them, on 116 on Frederick Douglass, that corner, before they get to the house, or somebody running this other way, or the cab driver and the other cab driver, fighting over, space, parking space. Or the guy at the corner talking about, saying that, man, you're selling this belt too much, and the guy who's a vendor there. And things like, those things, or the guy in the corner there that works daily, just got off the board, literally, and it works for another immigrant and he's not getting paid because he has no documents, meaning he does get paid, but not in the manner other people do get paid in terms of the wages and things like that. So that collective memory, how does one get that beauty of it? And even the laughter or the soul of the conversation. Some of it is louder than others. If you find 5 or 6 cab drivers on that side, I'm using cab drivers for there, from maybe Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, you'll find that it's almost a boisterous conversation in relationship to one and the other. So now imagine that you have been recording this like a camera, and it's locked up somewhere in your subconscious. And so in the idea of memory and writing for me has to, in the case of Musa, now that I'm writing about that existential, that life, and I'm also, when he moves back to Africa, I'm also writing about the places that I have been, the people that I've seen, the NGO experts who are there, who know everything, and say, Africans or anywhere else, I'm sure it's the same thing. It's like, we need to teach them how to drink water, quote unquote. I mean, people know how to drink water, right? I'm just spoofing them. But how do you unlock what you've recorded all these years in memory? It's subconscious. You do not remember every moment. You do not know anything. So now, the reason why Doorman was abandoned and Musa became the new novel is that I had an epiphany. The epiphany I discussed before was that it's conjoined, it's concurrent. Nostalgia itself and memory is one that is ongoing in the relationship between, for example, India and the United States for that immigrant. And they're always calling, or there's somebody visiting, or they're doing that. So there is no localized thing. It is carried, and there's a conversation between those things. So how do I get to the point where that 10 years or 15 years from the 90s onwards is a lot of time, and all that back and forth that I've had in traveling, all the things that I've seen, what will be suitable for the novel, and what can I actually remember? Because a lot of it I don't remember. I found out that to unlock all of these things, one has to get to a point where they can excavate their memory. And the only way you can actually do that is to actually find, at least for me, is to find that place that now is almost like a volcanic eruption in that it now spills all this stuff while you're writing because you made that adjustment. Instead of doorman who was stuck in Manhattan and thinking about East Africa, specifically Somalia, Musa is one that relates to the post-colony and the entire immigrant experience. You see, so now all that memory, I can now, while writing, think about, oh, that guy, he had a difficult time. He was deported because he got a ticket post 9/11 for peeing on the street, and was deported right after that. They discovered that he didn't have papers, right? So that's memory for me. You have to find it, unlock it somehow with the thing that, that the theme and the idea that you have, to bring it out in a sense that that memory will come and revisit you. But you have to find the key for it. And I don't think any of us know at any particular time what the key will be. It took me from 2011 to 2015 to realize that doorman is not going anywhere. And I didn't know why. And the reason now I know is that because he was never able to excavate.
Do you have time to ask one more question or go to Q&A? One more question in Q&A. Let me ask a final question of the panelists on Muslim American identity and memory. Collective identity often rests on collective memory. Is there a Muslim American collective memory or collective identity? A trend I'm seeing, some of you come from small underrepresented communities. You're Mexican Muslim, you're Somali Muslim, for instance. So the American Muslim experience is, you have this larger framework of Muslim Americans, but there are smaller communities, and their memories may be contributing to a larger collective memory. One community I'm particularly interested in is the Hispanic Muslim community. I spent part of my childhood in Spain. When I came to New York as a teenager, the mosque I gravitated to was the Alianza Islamica, which was the East Harlem Spanish-speaking mosque. And you could see right there, this was the late 90s, mid to late 90s, you could see a Hispanic Muslim identity forming, right? And their archive, the memory archive for the Hispanic Muslim community is Islamic Spain, right? If you look at the rise of Hispanic Muslim associations and mosques across the country, now you have Hispanic Muslim Day in New Jersey every year. You have a mosque that's opened up in Houston. Their archive, what they're reviving, what they're interested in is Al-Andalus, Alhambra, Cordoba, Toledo, and so on. And it's interesting to me is geographically, like in terms of location, how the narrative of one Muslim community, say the Hispanic Muslim community, will interact with that of the Somali Muslim community to maybe produce a collective memory, perhaps could produce a collective identity, but there's always a risk that the stronger group's memory will dominate or marginalize those of the weaker, smaller communities. So any thoughts on Muslim American identity?
Okay. So they say they have only a couple of minutes, and they gave the most long-winded person on the panel the mic. I think that's counterintuitive. Yes. So I think a collective memory, and what's really the big. I hate to use everywhere you go they'll say, oh, but that's the elephant in the room. So anyway, I'm going to use elephant in the room today. which means when we're talking about Muslims, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the United States? Are we talking about the immigrant Muslim? Are we talking about the American Muslim? Meaning, what are we talking about? So I gather from the discussion we're really talking about this place and time where we're at, which is the United States, and its conversations with other places and Muslims who are here. Now, how do I see my what collective memory? And I think I have to consider who is engaged in the same disseminating that identity. Who are those iconic figures for me? I would say, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, put a huge dent into the American landscape in terms of, who's, that idea that a Muslim exists in America. And, and there's also a long historical journey through slavery and onwards where a lot of people in New York, anywhere else, were actually, African-American, were Muslims from the beginning. I'm not saying all of them are, but there's a good contingent because they were from West Africa and other places. But this is I see the basis of today's post 9/11 divide and the previous one. But in terms of how this memory is now constructed, in my case, I see, for example, you might have recently, I forgot what it was about, CNN or somewhere had invited Muslims, and there was not one black person, or African American or other, or West African, in that panel, right? So there is a relationship to post 9/11 and the Muslim and how maybe the idea in the media today that is being propelled maybe that the African American or the black or whatever is not that there's a new identity that's running parallel with that's becoming more and more available. So how and I know that what is shaping this is also the mainstream media and the United States idea of race and things like that, right? We're all people of color, but I think that how do I think about what's going on? I'm trying to say, how do we have a narrative? I think the narrative because it's something like, I think something like 500 to, I think there's probably something like 500,000 Somalis who are majority Muslim, who live in the United States, particularly in Minnesota, Seattle, and other places, where they constitute kind of like pretty much the majority of immigrants. So it seems to me that even that collective narrative we know is fashioned and shaped in a way how it's disseminated through the American relationship with its own citizenship and whatever it is. So I'm going to try and wrap it up. It's your fault for me giving it to me the first one. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I'll be short then. Whether or not there's a collective Muslim American identity, I think it was something like that. Of course there is. And of course there's not, right? I mean, we're a lot of people. But I spoke before about how inauthentic and flawed memories are, right? But at the same time, they are also the most authentic thing there could be. Because at some level, when details get lost, when you decide as a creator of some sort of art form to put certain details and not certain details, it's coming from a certain feeling, right? And so you have a collective identity in some ways for a lot of issues, insofar as a lot of the times we do share feelings and we do share feelings about memories with certain people. When I was in high school and I had to do my, historical figure project, who did I choose? I chose Muhammad Ali, right? And you will find that for a lot of Muslims growing up, no matter whether or not they're like a young female Indian Muslim, they could be the total opposite. So there are certain things that we share. You know, in talking to a lot of Muslim Americans, a lot of us obviously have very similar feelings about what happened on 9/11 and how the country responded thereafter. That's a collective memory that helps us relate to people through our art, through our conversation, etc., etc. And then, of course, you have things, and there's something there to it, right? Like when I talked about things being inaccurate with my grandfather, you see things like Gandhi, you know, immortalized through movies and pop culture and things like that. And then you'll learn that man had a lot of strange things in his life that were not so good. Everybody forgot about those things, right? But that's why the people there at the time, a lot of the ones who knew those things and forgot to mention, is they were searching for a certain type of pride. They came from a certain type of pain. They came from being subjugated. And those feelings are authentic and real. And so you have this collective memory that we can, you know, unite on through our art forms, etc., etc. And then obviously, I mean, it goes without saying that I have no idea what it's like to be a young, you know, African-American Muslim or something like that, right? I mean, I don't think I need to elaborate on that. Sure.
So, kind of 3 takeaways, and leading up to them is just that human beings need to be seen, and they need to feel beautiful. If a human being doesn't feel they're seen and they don't feel they're beautiful, harmful things normally happen, whether to themselves or to another. And so in the need to be seen, we look around us. We look to stories, we look to movies, we look to our community, and we're like, do I see myself reflected in a positive and beautiful way? And if we don't see that, then we try to imagine it in the future. Okay, well, how can I put that in my life? And if we don't see a pathway, then we revert to memory. And this, to me, actually going back to memory and collective memory, and how memory gets played out in our community, communities, I should say, is that we don't feel beautiful and we don't feel seen, so we've romanticized the past. Because it's the only place that some of us feel safe in. And that's how I sit with the elders of our community, who are often the pathway to our current collective memory, which a lot of us find extremely flawed. That I have to remember that they've constructed it because they never felt beautiful and they never felt seen. And it allows me to be a little bit more kind and gentle with them in the mistakes that I feel they've made 40 to 50 years after that specific historical moment that I never lived. And so one, I just offer that to you all because I want to say be kind and be gentle to your memories. The second thing I want to add is in terms of Al-Andalusia, beautiful, you know, for everyone who's ever been, beautiful place, Granada, beautiful place. Who built Andalusia? Anyone? Like, where is the knowledge coming from? Where is the tradition coming from? And then where is the labor coming from at that specific moment in time? Al-Maghrib. The etymology of the word Moors literally means non-Roman of North African, i.e. Berber, Sub-Saharan African. And so in the same way, the Latino community and the indigenous community has worked hard, and we've failed in a lot of ways, in terms of whether we say decolonizing our memory or detoxing our memory, in terms of putting all the beauty upon Spain for what was actually indigenous in African life, labor, genius, innovation. In ways that also doesn't dismiss that Spain itself, you know, is both a monarchy at the time and then a whole bunch of people just working, the farmers, the anarchists in the south, is that Andalusia, when you go into, you're really talking about North Africa. The first, second, third old mosques in Africa are all in Tunisia. You know, from that it then spreads to Algeria, Libya, Morocco, and then into Andalusia. And so the second thing I want to offer to you is, in our collective memory, how do we detox and decolonize our memories? Not as an ending point, but a starting point for new conversations. Because, to be honest, I'm really frustrated with how decolonization has become an end goal, instead of just really introduction to imagining the world in new ways. The last thing I want to add in terms of memories is how many of you have ever had a relative who's had Alzheimer's or dementia? I buried one of my aunts about 6 weeks ago, who lost her battle with dementia. And as the mind collapses in on itself. And you see what happens to a person when they begin to lose their memories. And to think about that again, about being kind to our memories. And to understand the role this plays in people's psyche and their life in really profound physiological ways. You know, is that we have to cherish them. Like, we never know if they're ever going to be gone. And I actually think if you think of the ways in which those of you who've had relatives and you've seen the anger, the temper that comes out at times, the frustration of the inability to do basic things, what are the ways that that also affects us as a community because we are not in ownership of our collective memory? What are the ways, you know, not to be ableist, but what are the ways in which, a sense, we have an echo of the forms of dementia because our memories have been stolen? And we are grasping onto strands in very unhealthy ways. The last thought and the last point to add is just the framework to think of it as this: is there is no Muslim identity. There are only Muslim identities. To say otherwise is to flatten a law into one-dimensional plane, and that is not just to the creator or to the creation. And it's just a simple framing, like actually to just realize and approach this work with, whether as a creative, a person involved in social good and social impact, whether an educator, etc., is to say, I will no longer use the word identity in the singular. And you'll find that the conversations will become a lot more rich from that point.
Excellent, thank you. Let's open it up. Yeah, give him his, give our poet his props. Any questions, anyone, please?